Okay, last time I was talking about how when you look at Latin America, it's much more oriented towards Europe than it is actually in many ways towards the United States. I would argue that in part that's exacerbated by the Monroe Doctrine, where the United States sort of gives itself, big brother potential, or as we used to say back on the reservation, the Great White Father relationship with the rest of the Americas. And given American history, if you go back, and I'm sure they probably have something in Wikipedia about American invasions or interventions in Latin America in the 20th century. I think it's somewhere between 12 and 14, where the United States sent troops in. And we're always sending troops into Mexico in the early part of the 20th century. The Veracruz incident, I can't remember them all. But anyway, so if you're in Latin America, being in some way, shape, or form invaded by the United States is a real common phenomenon. And not surprisingly, people tend to get a little perturbed about it, because if they try to invade the United States, it wouldn't be seen the same way. In fact, to a certain extent, the whole perception that Russia has of the Ukraine versus the Ukraine has of Russia wouldn't be a bad analogy for, if the Ukraine was Latin America and Russia was the United States, in terms of Russia feeling it has the right to project its attitude, values, and military power wherever it wants to in areas it considers its interest. And in fact, I think the Russian propaganda machine was pretty big a year or two ago about pointing out that the United States does that with the Monroe Doctrine, which is still formal U.S. policy in 2022. So that's a bunch of side effects. One of the weird side effects is, of course, that, oops, what happened here? Is that in this entire situation, is you have, on one hand, this fraught relationship, I don't know how you want to call it. On the other hand, you have, very close economic ties in a bunch of ways. For much of Latin America, the United States is one of their largest trading partners. And the United States always has a very strong expectation that Latin America should buy from the United States, even though they don't necessarily reciprocate. And in fact, your Guatemala video was a good example of that. Americans want cheap products from Latin America, but they don't feel any need to subsidize the social systems and economic systems to make those cheap products possible. For example, coffee. So the idea that Americans should pay, fair trade, reasonable labor cost for coffee is not considered a source of political discussion in the United States. Never mind the fact that that would have a major impact on immigration, legal immigration to the United States from Latin America. So the United States very much sees themselves in a very much favored nation, or the big player on the block status. And of course, that tends to exacerbate the negative relationships in Latin America. In the 1970s, 1980s, once the European Common Market becomes the EU, and you have the Southeast Asian, I can remember what the acronym of that is, MECASUR, I think. Then what you also get is you have the Americas, in the sense of, minus North America, looking at their relationship both with other areas, specifically Europe, and also with North America, specifically in the United States. I should point out Canada doesn't have near these problems in the United States. It's peculiarly an American thing. It's not a North American thing. And so what they do is they set up a regional trade union, sort of mimicking the EU, but it was not as strong and didn't really have, as much sort of joint consensus on what they wanted. There wasn't as much agreement about it. They mainly set it up in many ways because, ironically, with the EU forming up, if you're Brazil or Venezuela or someplace like that, you had a very hard time continuing your goods and services relationship in terms of trade with Europe, because now Europe was a package. It wasn't Italy versus France versus Spain. And so the need to have a regional union to negotiate with the other regional union became one of the big pushes. And that's SAPTA. I think it has a new acronym now, but it's basically the South American Free Trade Organization. And it actually includes a fair number of folks in what might be called Central America, though Caribbean nations aren't involved in that. Caribbean nations were trying to set up some sort of regional organization also, but the problem in the Caribbean is so much of the Caribbean is still owned by colonial powers, the United States, the Brits, the French, etc., that I think just sort of fell through. So what you get is this regional trade organization for South America, Southern Latin America, is set up in, I believe, the late 70s, early 80s. And that's sort of become the go-to. There was a big push with some of the members, especially Brazil and Argentina, to making it a much more sort of politically powerful entities, sort of like the EU turned into, where it went initially from trade economics and became much more of a sort of social political, entity. And that hasn't happened because Latin American politics tend to be really, really divisive. And then on top of that, Latin American politics, of course, in much of Latin America are tied to, very small proportions of the population that are both well-educated and are enormous landowners. So it's a rather skewed system in the sense that you're not really reflecting, in many cases, the majority population of the countries that you're, sort of making the decisions for. In response to the South American one setting up, all of a sudden the United States realized that we were going to be aced out because South American trade was very much pushing to increase their trade with Europe and sort of basically give the United States the middle finger, since the United States was always demanding special treatment and it was never reciprocated. And so what happened is the United States went to Canada and Mexico and sort of browbeat them, since they share a border, into forming the NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Association, with the idea that then trade, tariffs and various things like that would be basically removed between the three countries. Canada and the United States already had something like that for some stuff. But Mexico and the United States have always had a very fraught relationship in the last couple of 100 years. And, it's really strange. And so the NAFTA never worked particularly well, just because the United States wanted to make sure that every time we did something, it was to our benefit and we maximized our profit out of it. We really didn't care about our, quote, partners, unquote. So it was basically take and not give, if possible. So NAFTA stumbled on its main function, we'll see when we get into it, is the maquiladoras we'll get to next. But the other aspect of this was that it tended to actually sort of reinforce the Monroe Doctrine, because in the rest of the Americas, you'll start seeing, well, the United States finds some buddies, and they become sort of the big economic bullies in the North, and they're going to try to tell us what to do in the rest of the Americas. And this is still the spin you get politically in a lot of Latin America, is the United States is this sort of really aggro, mercenary, nasty country that wants to, makes noise about friendship, but in reality wants to maximize its profit and minimize its cost, and really doesn't care about the rest of the Americas. And on one hand, that's exaggeration, but it's not necessarily completely inaccurate also. So the last part of this Latin American thing is the two areas are very, very divergent. Latin America largely, and this includes Mexico even more and more, sees Europe as being their most stable trade partner. So they're very worried about the current condition of the EU and its sort of unraveling. They also more and more are tremendously fascinated with China. Of course, China is tremendously fascinated with getting involved in Latin America, simply because, one, that just irritates the United States, which the Chinese think is sort of fun. And secondly, because Latin America is such an enormous market, especially in terms of generating resources, generate a huge amount of beef, of grain, of stuff like that, all of which China needs desperately. So the Chinese are really rapidly trying to move into the Latin American region. And of course, then what happens, the United States starts invoking the Monroe Doctrine again. And if you're a Latin American country, if you're a big country like Brazil or someplace like that, you get really peeved when the United States, which is 1,500 miles to the north, starts lecturing you on who your buddies are that you go out drinking with. Basically, it's none of their business. It's your attitude. From the United States, everything that happens in two continents is our business, which is pretty ego when you think about it. And that's sort of the state of affairs right now. Various presidents have done very little to improve Latin American relationships. The Bush administration's just made a disaster of it. Obama really didn't do much better. Trump just blew up the whole thing, basically, for all intents and purposes. And Biden, who knows? The U.S. Congress is especially now, is so focused on illegal immigration into the United States that they blame the Latin American countries for that, but they don't have any sort of discussion about how the United States would help mitigate it, or how the United States is partially responsible for it. So, and again, if you're in Latin America, you're sort of like, well, you guys can't have it every way you want. A really good example that goes way back into history, 40, 50 years, is the fact that the drug cartels in Latin America make all their money off of what they sell in the United States. It's the American consumers that fund the drug cartels. It's not like someone sticks your gun up against your head and says, "Hey, you got to do cocaine or something like that." It's the Americans have the money to have recreational drugs, and Latin America provides it, and that's one of their major monetary streams. It's a form of trade, and their attitude in Latin America is, well, on one hand, we'll do something to control drug trade. But on the other hand, if the United States is the ones that's buying it, it's up to the United States to control the trade, since the United States are the consumers, the United States are the ones whose borders it's going through. So, a lot of this stuff tends up being really, really complicated. And it's sort of striking when you look at newspapers from Mexico or some other place in Latin America, how they view us. In fact, you even get this if you look at Canadian newspapers in terms of how they view the United States. Our self-image of ourselves is so incredibly flattering compared to how the rest of the Americas view us. So it's sort of a real wake-up call when you think of how Americans are perceived in the world. There's a lot of very complex, sort of dense history and even current behavior that leads to that situation.